Greetings, all CHP listeners tuning in from all over the world. Me again, Laszlo Montgomery, with one more CHP special episode. This one's doubly special because not only am I interviewing an interesting guest, Mr. Joel Bigman, he's been a CHP listener, Patreon supporter, and frequent pen pal of your humble narrator, going back a long time now. And besides all that, we also share the same publisher, the company that's been given us a plethora of great titles over the years about China and beyond. Earnshaw Books, Graham Earnshaw, the venerable proprietor. This one from Joel Bigman is fresh out of the oven, available at all the usual suspects since December 2024. Joel's new book is entitled The Second Journey. And if you're a fan of the classic Ming Dynasty novel, COG, The Journey to the West, this one may pique your interest. All the way from Yerushalayim in the state of Israel, welcome to the CHP, Joel Bigman.
Hi, Laszlo. How are you doing?
Pleasure to have you on.
It's my pleasure to be here, very much so. I actually never dreamed I would be a guest on your show. It's always
dreams come true.
Okay, occasionally.
You know, it seems like years since you first mentioned to me in an email that you were, writing this novel, and it's billed as the world's first Chinese-Jewish historical fantasy. So, what's it actually about? And if you don't mind, for any listeners who haven't read Journey to the West, can you also briefly explain that story and how you came to write about this second journey? Well, 3 questions for the price of 1.
3 questions for the price of 1. Let's start with the Ming Dynasty journey to the West. We have to start somewhere. And this is a Chinese historical fantasy. I don't know what else one could call it, but it's based on the true story of the Chinese Buddhist monk Xuanzang in the 7th century. And also, you correct me if I get any historical details wrong. During the Tang Dynasty, who traveled to India to bring back the correct Buddhist scriptures because he was unhappy with the quality or the errors that were in the Buddhist scriptures that were currently in China. And this was a trip that took him many years. He spent many years in India, at the various Buddhist monasteries and universities there, and returned to China and became a national hero. If you go to Xi'an today, you'll see the pagoda they built in his honor. It's still there, the Great Wild Goose Pagoda. In any case, this was all back in the 7th century, about 650 or so. So he's like a religious scholar hero. However, generations later, during the Ming Dynasty, I think early 16th century, if I'm not mistaken, a fantasy was published featuring this same monk. But this time, his journey to the West being India, if you're starting in China, involved a much more interesting collection of characters because he travels with the Monkey King, Sun Wukong. And you correct my pronunciation, Laszlo, because my Chinese
good enough.
is non-existent. With Tsu Baji, who's the pig, and there's a shaman, or Sandy, sometimes called, and a horse was originally a dragon. And they go on this crazy journey to the West. And on the way, they overcome all kinds of obstacles and monsters. It's a very interesting novel because it's, on the one hand, it's like sort of a comic book overcoming demons, but on the other hand, it has a lot to do with the development of these different characters. And the characters themselves are represent different parts of one human character. It's hopefully most of your listeners are somewhat familiar with it. If they're not, might be a good idea to hear about it. That's the journey to the West.
Let's dive right in. Hey, time is money. There's so many to choose from. Which Jewish legends did you insert into the second journey?
So the Jewish legends come from several sources. Some are from the Bible, actually, and I'll give an example in a few moments. And some are from the Talmud. The Talmud is a rather large collection of mostly legal writings, but interspersed in there are all sorts of legends, accounts of things that the rabbis did. So Jewish legends from the Bible, for example, is the crossing of the Red Sea, appears in the second journey, but with a Chinese twist. There's a famous rainmaker in Jewish legend, and of course, rainmaking is a common need in all cultures. So there's sort of a combination Chinese-Jewish rainmaking event. And I even took one of the more obscure, mystical, ununderstandable Jewish legends. There's something, it's called in Hebrew the Pardes, where four famous rabbis, we're talking about rabbis who lived in the 2nd century AD, go into what's called an orchard, but they have some kind of mystical experience there. The experience they have in my book is much, much different than what most people would interpret this as being, let's say. That's the kinds of sources of the legends and the types of legends that I've used. I should point out that I've written a fantasy and I've played fast and easy with the chronology. As I mentioned, the original Xuanzang traveled to India in the 7th century, and all the rabbis I'm talking about lived a few hundred years before that. But fantasy is fantasy. You know, if you can have a magic pig and a superhero monkey, then what's a
pretty
few
much
centuries?
anything is fair game.
Yeah, that's what I figure.
So you really did a bang-up job with how you did this. Can you give us a few examples of chapters that blended Chinese and Jewish elements in your book?
Okay, I mentioned that some of these stories come from the Bible, like the crossing of the Red Sea. What I do is I have Xuanzang. He only goes with the pig and the monkey in my book. I don't take all the travelers with me. And they come visit a rabbi named Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir lived in the 2nd century. He's a very central figure in Jewish history. And they happen to show up there on Passover. And on Passover, as some of your listeners will know, that we always have a Passover Seder, a special holiday meal, and you read texts that relate to the Exodus and eat too much matzah. And people do it to this day. We've been doing it for a very long time. But now they've got these foreign guests there. You've got this Buddhist monk, a monkey, and a pig at the Seder table. And one of the things you do at the Seder table is you drink wine. And monkey drinks wine. He likes to drink wine. For those who are the story, the Journey to the West, one of the first things that happens is he goes up to the heaven and drinks too much wine at the god's feast up there, gets drunk, and raises a ruckus and gets into a lot of trouble. But here he drinks 4 cups of wine, which is traditional, and falls asleep. And he finds himself at the Red Sea with Moses. He doesn't really understand it. It's Moses at first, but it's Moses, and there's a bunch of sheep, and there's the people of Israel, and they've got the Red Sea, and they've got to cross the Red Sea. And Moses is having trouble doing this. He's supposed to raise his staff and cross the Red Sea. The waters will part. There'll be walls on both sides, like I don't know if you've ever seen Cecil D. DeMille's movie, or there was the Prince of Egypt. There was an animated feature based on this. But he tries it. It doesn't work. So Sun Wukong has a rod too. He's got a magic staff. He tries it with that staff, and it doesn't work. Now, what happens in the Journey to the West is whenever you get stuck, and Monkey always, despite his superpowers, he always needs to go get help. He realizes who can help him. And here I've actually used a verse that people are not usually paying too much attention to. But if you look at the Bible, how does the Red Sea split? Like, why would the water move? And the verse says, well, God brought a strong east wind that blew the water aside. Now, if you need a wind, who do you go to? Lady Iron Fan, who's one of the Monkey King's, Sun Wukong's, I don't know what to call her, a nemesis, but she's definitely a character he has some difficulty with. He goes to her and asks her if she'd come along to help him blow the water aside so that the people of Israel can cross the Red Sea. She doesn't want to at first because she's had some very, very bad experiences with him. In a different novel, mind you, but that's where she's from. So But eventually she agrees. She goes over there, and the children is across the sea. It's kind of a dream scene, but it's kind of also an example of how I've mixed two different traditions in a kind of, I would say, different way. There's another one, and again, it depends how familiar your listeners are with both texts. There's a chapter in the Journey to the West where the three disciples of Xuanzang go to a Taoist temple, and there are statues there of the three pure ones, which we could go into that who they are, but maybe you could explain better in a different podcast. But in any case, they decide that they want to eat all the offerings that are being brought to these gods, and they want to get rid of the statues and replace them. And there's a really curious scene there where Sun Wukong tells Pixie to take the statues and throw them in the latrine. There's a pit toilet there. He even has a code name for it. He calls it the 5 Grains Transmigration Burrow or something. and the pig takes these statues on his shoulders. He's a big guy, the pig, and he lumbers over and throws them into the latrine, the whole time singing a little pseudo-religious ditty. Well, you're the 3 pure ones, but now you're going to be the 3 stinky ones. It's kind of hilarious, but there's, of course, a point in there because we're talking about basically Buddhist monks being kind of nasty to the Taoist gods here. But again, that's for somebody who's got a better background in Chinese religion than I do. In any case, there's that's the original Journey to the West, but there's a very ancient Jewish legend about Abraham, who we call Father Abraham to this day, whose father was, in the legend, an idol manufacturer. He would make statues of various idols, and one day he leaves Abraham alone in the store to sell these idols. When people come in, he convinces them that they shouldn't bother buying an idol because they're just bits of painted clay. We made them yesterday. And eventually he takes a hammer and smashes the idols, except for one, and he puts the hammer in the hand of one of the idols, sort of, realizing or trying to show that it's absurd, the idea that this idol would have smashed the other ones. And he was trying to show that this is the whole thing is kind of silly. Well, I had this legend happen, except for while Abraham's doing it, these travelers show up, and the pig and monkey help him take care of the idols while referring to their own experience with the Taoist gods from the other novel. So they're kind of mixed up there in a, I'd say, curious kind of way. Those are 2 examples of what I've done with this. I see a lot of parallels between Chinese culture and Jewish culture, but they're parallels, but they're very, very different. And I'm going to go a little bit off track for a moment, Laszlo. Most of us in the West come from a monotheistic viewpoint, right? And when you go to China or Taiwan or Japan, and they've got thousands of gods. There's like no end to them. There's spirits everywhere, and it's bewildering to the Western observer. Come there and you're like, what is all this? And I was sitting with a friend in Taiwan who's Chinese, and I had this discussion with her, and she was bewildered by the idea that there'd be only one God. To her, it was this totally crazy foreign idea. How could that possibly be? So if you have to keep like an open mind towards other people's cultures. And actually, that's one of the main messages of my book is I'm not trying to convince anybody to become, Jewish or Chinese. The basic idea is to have some respect and understanding for somebody else's ideas, not to convince them and not necessarily to throw somebody else's gods into the toilet either.
What inspired you to combine these 2 rather different but ancient cultures, Chinese and Jewish? What inspired you to combine them and to come up with the story?
What inspired me to combine them is very hard to nail down. I got this. I come from a very Jewish background and familiar with all these Jewish texts, and I work in the I worked in the semiconductor industry. I'm a chemist, actually. So I've been traveling for many years to Taiwan, to China, Korea, Japan, Singapore. And over time, your eyes open. You start paying attention to what's going on. I've had people tell me, I recall a very distinct conversation in Tainan, in southern Taiwan, where the gentleman says, oh, here we are, representatives of two great ancient cultures. I'm thinking to myself, well, your great ancient culture has like 1 billion people, and my great ancient culture has maybe 10 or 15 million. But there's something to it. And there's also something else that's common is a respect for ancient literature in both cultures. In any case, that kind of explains why I became interested in Chinese culture. It doesn't explain why I thought about combining them, and I don't really have an honest answer to that. I have I guess it has to do with a creative mind. I tend to try to take things that are not necessarily connected and find the connection. And because I was interested in these two cultures, I thought, hey, I wonder if we could combine them.
So what were the common threads or similar aspects that you found in both Chinese and Jewish cultures?
Well, like I said, one is huge respect for books, for ancient literature. That's a great one. There are some things that are really obvious, maybe it's true in most cultures. Respect for elders, respect for teachers, for wise people. These are things that are all cultures. And I found, I actually realized after I started reading some of the Chinese literature that there are many other things like rainmaking I mentioned, which are common needs for any agricultural society. You need rain, and how to have rain becomes a religious issue. How do you make sure to have rain? I didn't even know which Chinese book I was going to use as a base, actually. I had the idea of combining the two cultures before I knew how I was going to do it. And I started reading the classic Chinese novels. I first read The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Why? I don't know. I looked at a list of the books and I said, let's buy this one. And I did. It's a fairly long tome, and a lot of these books get kind of repetitive after a while, but there are some interesting things in there, and it is a central text in Chinese culture. I read it, and I'm thinking that, I could combine this with some biblical wars or something, and I read it and decided that it was an absolute no-go. I didn't know what to do with it. It just didn't click. But I finished the book. Then I read The Journey to the West, and I saw the characters, and I realized that this could work.
Even though Zhu Bajie wasn't kosher?
Yeah, well, the fact that he wasn't kosher works to his advantage when he's visiting Jewish communities because nobody's going to even think of eating him.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of advantage. He does run into some trouble because he decides to go sit in a Beit Midrash, in a Jewish study hall where all these Jewish scholars are there, and there's some concern whether they're going to like having a pig sitting next to them on the bench. There's a few eyebrows raised, but they're very polite, and he sits there. He doesn't understand very much. He's not known for his wisdom. He's often called idiot in the original Journey to the West. So I think it's the characters that drew me to that particular book. They're really amazing characters. And I picked the two strongest characters, of course, who their behavior sometimes reminds one of the Three Stooges, if you recall that old show. They're constantly poking at each other and making comments at each other and teasing, but they have no relation to the Three Stooges, but it's a similar kind of relationship. So that's how, I forget what your actual question was right now, but that was the actual process I went through. Now, once I actually had this basic idea, I wrote a trial chapter and showed it to a few people. I don't know if you've ever written something that's totally fictional. but there's a lot of uncertainty. You write something, and is it going to come out right? Does it make sense? What are people going to think? A lot of writers have this kind of feelings of uncertainty. I got fairly good feedback, and so I charged ahead, wrote another chapter, and found Earnshaw Books. They had some comments. I made some further changes, and now we have a finished product.
Which differences between the two cultures did you find stand out the most between Jewish and Chinese cultures?
The main difference is this question of monotheism, which I mentioned earlier, and I had some difficulty with this. It's a very blatant difference, right? We have one God, or we have like a lonely heaven. There's some angels and so on, but basically one God. And the Chinese heaven is very crowded. And I had a lot of difficulty in combining those two. I wasn't sure how to handle it, and I ended up having two separate heavens. The world is divided in half. There's a Western heaven with one God, and there's an Eastern heaven with the pantheon of Chinese deities. I'm not sure that some of my monotheistic friends would feel so comfortable with that, but that's how I dealt with it. You have to do something to combine or have these two worlds live in parallel, which they do in real life, right? There's a billion Chinese think there are many deities, and all of Muslims and Christians and Jews all will insist that there's one. So apparently both exist. The question is how. That's like the main difference. I want to make another comment, and I'm not an expert in Chinese philosophy, but many Jews are attracted to Buddhism. And for a while I thought, there must be some similarities between Judaism and Buddhism, but I think that's not really true. I think it's more Confucianism that's closer to Jewish thinking. It's more like, respect for the elders, following the rules, doing things correctly, concern about how the community is going to operate. If everybody follows the rules, then the whole community will work better. I think Jews are attracted to Buddhism more because it's different. It's the same. And Taoism as a philosophy, I think, can work well with some Jewish thinking. Of course, when we talk about popular or folk Chinese religion, that's a different ballgame altogether. It's fun, but it's very, very different.
So, like me, you're no spring chicken. So, what was the path you took as far as your interest in Chinese culture?
I'm going to tell you something you may or may not know, Laszlo. I was in China for the first time in 1984. This time of year, actually. At the time, I lived in Chicago, and my company was invited to present their products in Beijing. I don't know when you first showed up in that part of the world, but China then was very, very different, very primitive. Well, it was a time warp. There's no other word for it. There were no automobiles, and it was just very different. Of course, people were wearing Mao suits, and it was a different world, but I don't think it made a lasting impression on me. I think what piqued my interest really is because I started developing personal relationships with the people I work with, and so I started asking a lot of questions. And when you ask questions, you get answers, it always triggers another question and another question. Then at some point you say, well, I'm spending a lot of time in the car. Why don't I listen to some podcasts about Chinese history?
I know a good one I could recommend.
Yes, well, I found yours, and I have to thank you a lot because you certainly helped me a lot. Very hard to keep. You come from Chicago or from Jerusalem, and what do you know about the Han or the Tang or the Song or Qing or and which dynasty were Mongols and which ones were Manchurians and who tried attacking the Japanese? it's overwhelming, actually. It's obviously a huge amount of history. And I managed, with your help, to somehow get it more or less straight in my head. I must admit, to this day, sometimes I'm confused about which dynasty is what. But you need to have some basic timeline to be able to make sense of all that. So your podcast was a great help. And then at some point, I got into my head, like I was telling you, to read the Chinese classics. So I did read Romance of the Three Kingdoms, A Journey to the West. I'm actually reading it a third time now. I heard Water Margin as a podcast.
John Chu.
Yes. He retells the stories with some of his own comments inside. But it's great. Which one have I missed? The Dream of the Red Chamber.
Don't forget that.
Also. And I actually read the Unmentionable book, which is a Jinping Mei. I know this is a family show, so we can't say too much about it.
I know.
But actually, in many ways, though, it's a very well-written novel, and it has a real strong moral message, despite the somewhat risque parts of it, and a lot of social comment about the stratification of Chinese culture at the time. So I don't know if I would reread it, but it was. I'm glad I did, actually. And after having read all those books, and I will comment also on The Journey to the West, I read Anthony C. Yu's unabridged translation, and he has a huge amount of footnotes and an extensive introduction. So you go through the book, and this kind of literature, every other sentence, they're referring to something else that the reader, or at least the original reader or listener, was already aware of. But you're living on a different continent, 500 years later, and you have no idea. But Anthony C. Yu did, and he wrote it in a footnote. So you have to keep flipping back and forth. And there's all sorts of Taoist concepts, references to ancient poems, another great feature of Chinese culture for many, many generations. Poetry was a big thing. I think you did a series on poetry at some point. Was there a CHP series on Tang Dynasty poetry or the history of Chinese poetry?
Yeah, I did on Tang poetry once. It was a bestseller in its day.
I don't read Chinese, so I see all the poetry only in translation, which is I'm sure you lose a lot. I'm bilingual, Hebrew and English, and a little bit of Aramaic, so I'm aware of how much get lost in translation and in poetry. Some people read to me one of the Psalms in English, and I'm like, what is that? They're missing half of it. And it's always like that. I've actually done some translation myself in the past. And you lose a lot. It's very difficult to translate. But I owe a great debt to Anthony C. Yu, who he's no longer alive, unfortunately, so I can't really thank him personally. But it really helped me a lot, the details in his book.
So like me, you're not Chinese, yet you have this passion to be a lifelong student and to share what you know. What do you have to say about the importance of knowing about other cultures, and maybe Chinese culture in particular?
When we were born into a family that has its own culture, and we have our own customs. It could be things as simple as having a birthday cake on a birthday, or if you're American, you celebrate Thanksgiving or Father's Day or Mother's Day, and you just take that for granted. But other people have different cultures, and it could be somebody in South America has, they're in the same hemisphere, but their culture's different. And it could be somebody in Africa, and people don't pay enough attention to what goes on in Africa and their culture there. Part of the problem is that people, and I'm actually pointing a finger at myself here as well, people only know one language, to some degree only know one culture. I grew up in the U.S., and the U.S. has far too many people who only speak English. If you go to Europe, it's very difficult to speak only one language. Maybe in England you can, but if you're in France or Belgium or Poland, so you speak many languages. You have to, people cross borders, and it's natural to speak different languages and be exposed to cultures that are at least a little bit different. Chinese culture is far, far different from Western culture, and maybe it's a reason, actually, to take a look at a culture that's really different from your own, and in a way, open your mind to other cultures in general. It's a question of opening your mind, and it doesn't work for everybody. A lot of people, I'm happy where I am, and I prefer to not understand other people. It sounds like a strange thing, but most people are like that, right? They don't really try to understand what other people are thinking. Maybe they feel threatened by it. I really don't know. I find that I'm more open-minded to these things, and I'd like to learn about other cultures. I feel like I've strengthened my understanding of my own culture by studying other people's cultures. It didn't threaten me. If anything, it strengthened me because I can look at my own culture and understand what it really is, what it's like. I have this ancient written tradition. I have an ancient oral tradition. Other cultures do that too, and it gives me some insight into how my texts look. I'll give you a quick example. We in the synagogue we read the Bible, the Torah, out loud every week. Everybody gathers in the room, and they bring out the Torah scroll, which to this day is handwritten on parchment. It's a scroll. It's not a book. And they read it, and everybody follows around in a printed Bible. You can follow it in Hebrew or Hebrew in the English translation. And my synagogue, there's 200 people who are doing that. My brother is a rabbi, also a little bit of a creative thinker, and he once told me, well, hang on a second. When they first instituted this reading the Bible in public once a week, most people didn't know how to read, and nobody had a printed book because it was 500 BC. When this was instituted, everyone would sit there and just listen. So when you go to the synagogue on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, don't pick up the printed book. Try sometimes to leave it shut and just listen to the story, because that's how it was originally done. And if you think about stories like The Journey to the West, apparently these were originally told by storytellers who would go around to the tea houses, and they were the entertainment, right? They hadn't invented television yet. So instead of watching Bugs Bunny or whatever, they would have to go to the tea shop and hear the storyteller tell the story. And that's how these stories are supposed to be heard. So there's certain parallels in how cultures develop, and you understand your own culture better if you understand that. Like I said, not everybody has this kind of open attitude and feels strengthened by learning about other cultures. But I certainly do, and I certainly hope that your listeners do, because if they're listening to the China History Podcast, they obviously have an interest in different cultures, right?
Well, in your book, again, called The First Chinese Jewish Historical Fantasy, but, readers will get a little bit of both cultures in your book, and it's really, I wish you a lot of success with it. It's certainly very original. Let me ask you, what are your writing plans for the future? Did Graham sign you to any seven-figure multi-book deals yet?
Not yet.
Okay, that call is coming.
We'll see. This is actually not the first novel I've written. It's the first one that actually has gotten properly published. I'm writing now something that's not connected to China at all. It's a novel about some college students who pull what they think is a great prank for a Christmas party. They develop a bacteria that you take as a little pill, and it brews alcohol in your stomach. There's actually it's a syndrome called auto-brewery syndrome. It really exists. And what happens then is that every time you eat pasta, the bacteria in your stomach turn it into beer, and you become drunk. So when the bacteria just gets out of control, it could be kind of interesting for society. And I have a book that follows that and follows these students trying to redeem themselves in the world from this disaster they've created. I'm actually dreaming of the next one, and I'm not entirely sure. It's just supposed to be about Michelangelo, and I have this crazy idea in my head to do something that's done in some of the Chinese books. Again, I'm mentioning Jinping Mei, and I won't go into the details of that book, but it starts with a chapter that's lifted straight out of Water Margin. There's a hero there, Wu Song, Wu II, who kills a tiger with his bare hands. And it's complicated. A story with his brother and his sister-in-law. And that first chapter is taken basically verbatim as the beginning of an entirely different novel. And I'm thinking of doing something similar, taking something from that novel and using it in a novel about Renaissance Italy. But I haven't started writing it yet, so this is just my crazy idea at this point.
All right, well, I think we have gone on long enough. Today's actually the last day of 2024. You're 10 hours ahead of me, so you need to get ready to start your New Year's Eve celebrations, and you already lit those Hanukkah candles. So we still have 28 days to go yet before we usher in the Year of the Snake. Well, Joel, in our regular email exchanges, I remember, dang, you started talking about this book idea years ago. And now, finally, in December 2024, the day has come. Mazel tov on the publication of this very unique book. So, once again, ladies and gentlemen, it's called The Second Journey. The author is Mr. Joel Bigman, and you can be sure it comes to us thanks to that old trustworthy repository of fine books about China and beyond, Earnshaw Books. Thanks for taking time to be with me, Joel.
Been my pleasure.
Any last-minute words you'd like to say to the CHP audience?
Well, in certain Chinese traditions, the wiser the person is, the more foolish he feels. So you run out of wise words to say at some point. I would like to wish everybody a good year. That's a more of a Jewish thing to say, though some people say Happy New Year. We say Shana Tova, which is a good year. The Chinese will wish each other health and prosperity, I believe, something along those lines.
And a million other lucky sayings.
Other things, right? So everybody in your respective New Year's, have a good one. At least have a better one than the past.
Yeah, and a peaceful one, huh?
Amen.
Well, that's it, everyone, everywhere, all at once. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California, in the state of confusion on this very last day of 2024, but no one's going to hear this until January earliest. Please think about coming back once more with feeling for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.